And welcome back. Releasing Aging People in Prison, better known as the RAPP campaign, is an independent grassroots organization as well as a policy project. The campaign challenges a fundamental pillar of mass incarceration, reliance on a system of permanent punishment, a racist culture of retribution and revenge rather than rehabilitation and healing. RAPP focuses on aging people behind bars, many of whom are long-termers convicted of serious crimes. Their goal is to dismantle the racist punishment system and promote the use of key mechanisms for release, such as parole, compassionate release, clemency, and policy changes. Joining me to share a little bit more in this conversation, I'm joined by the director of the Release Aging People in Prison RAPP campaign, Jose Saldana. And we thank you so much for being with us, Jose.
And thank you for the invite, and I'm surely happy to be here.
Good. Well, we talk about aging people, an aging population, particularly in incarceration. It's a controversial issue, we have to admit. There's a lot of people who have some sensitivity to the matter, and then you have your sticklers who say, you know, you got to do your time. Talk to us a little bit about the work that you're doing and why you feel it's important.
Well, we seek to end mass incarceration, at least counter the policies that created mass incarceration, and promote racial justice to the release of older and aging people in prison. Everybody ages in prison. And we're talking about a population that from 55 on up, men and women who have already languished in prison for 3 to 4 decades, and who have been mentors, educators, and even scholars during these decades of incarceration, they pose the least risk to public safety, yet they are the most difficult to win release. So we're actually trying to address the legacy of racism in our criminal justice system through the release of the most vulnerable people toward the incarceration period.
And when we talk about aging populations, give me a little bit of an insider's view. When we talk about those who are aging in prison, what are some of the things that maybe the general public does not know that maybe we should be paying attention to?
Well, a person that's 55 years old in prison and has languished in prison for decades, this person is closer. Chronologically, this person is closer to 65 than 55. Due to the underlying health conditions that most people have as they age in prison and the lack of adequate medical care. The New York State prison system have actually reduced the longevity of Black and brown people to 58 years old. That means in the last 10, 11 years, over 700 people 50 and over have died in New York State prisons. And the average age of death was 58 years old.
Wow. So when we talk about the issue of mass incarceration, obviously, we know that Black and brown people do more time in jail, even though we make up less of the population. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, talks about mass incarceration. How are you tackling this issue? Because we know that not only do you deal with the incarceration issue, but you got to deal with the sentencing issue, which is where much of your work comes in.
Yes, for literally decades, you know, Republicans have controlled the policies of New York State. So advocates have gotten very, very little meaningful reforms in the criminal justice system. So we advocate for 2 bills that would actually change the whole release process in New York State. The first bill addresses the most inhumane sentences given to Black and brown people over decades. And this bill actually provides that if a person has reached 55 years old and has served 15 years, he or she will automatically be entitled to a parole release interview. There are no guarantees. This bill actually gives hopes to men and women who, in all likelihood, will die in prison. And we're talking, let me just back up a little bit, because we're talking about intergenerational incarceration. When we say mass incarceration, we mean grandmothers, grandfathers, fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, all in prison during the same period across New York State. Just imagine just imagine what that looks like. A grandfather having a grandson somewhere in a prison cell somewhere in New York State, as well as a father. So if this were white people that were subjected to this, we would probably call it neo-genocide. So back to the question now, we have to address this inhumane justice that Black and brown people have been subjected to. And this bill is a means or an approach of addressing it. But the bill by itself won't matter much if we do not provide another bill, which we call the Fair and Timely Parole Bill. This bill was just passed in the Crimes Committee a couple of hours ago. It will now go to the New York State Senate. But this bill provides that the parole board will have to evaluate whether to release a person based on whether this person is a current risk to public safety. And that word, that phrase is very important because no longer would they be exclusively allowed to say that you pose a risk to public safety based on a crime that was committed decades ago, and in some cases, over 4 decades ago. And we also advocate for the New York State Parole Board to be fully staffed with 19 parole commissioners, all who believe in redemption and value human transformation. So these 3 initiatives, we believe, will go a long way toward at least correcting the evils that mass incarceration has inflicted on our people and assure that the next generation will not be subjected to it.
What kind of response have you gotten? I mean, I know you said one just got out of committee right now, headed towards the Senate, but what response are you getting from elected officials just in conversation about the bill?
Well, we've had substantial co-sponsors. We surprisingly, even during the pandemic, some of these electors have actually co-sponsored our bills. So we believe, we're optimistic that in an era now where the Democrats not only are the majority, but are the supermajority, and we are getting some younger Democrats actually being elected into office, more to the left, we think that we can probably get something happening this session.
So where do you see things going as far as, you know, we're in a budget season right now. We're also in that bill season where things are going forward to the table. Are you optimistic that this will get to the table and voted up or down real soon?
Yes, this is not just a moral issue. This also has fiscal implications. Just imagine it takes up to $240,000 to actually house one elderly person a year. So if we got over 9,000 elderly people, if we could just release half of those, look at the hundreds of millions that would be saved and could be allocated for much needed social services in our communities.
So let's talk a little bit more about legislative matters, because there are those bills on the table, and there's a lot of advocacy that still goes around the prison release system, or I should say prison release within the system. Talk to me about what are some of the other things that people, the public, should be made aware of when it comes to advocacy for those who are aging.
Well, I think the media seems to highlight the most horrible cases of people who are released from prison. But what the media doesn't advertise, the media doesn't cover, is the most successful ones. Like myself, I'm formerly incarcerated. I was released after 38 years. And there are literally dozens of me, because few of us do get out. And unfortunately, more die in prison. But those who do get out come out here, and we are perhaps the most civic-minded individuals in our communities, and we are overly concerned with the plight of our youth. And we are the ones, we are the original credible messengers. You don't hear about us, but we are those credible messengers who are going into the worst communities in our city and reaching these at-risk youth who will more than likely, without any guidance whatsoever, end up in prison.
Yeah. What is it like for a family that has to deal with a person that is aging in prison?
Well, mass incarceration has devastated families across our communities. and will continue to do so unless we correct this evil. No, we advocate for the persons to be released at their first appearance before the parole board, rather their 14th or 15th or 20th appearance when they're too old to be productive. Release men and women at an age where they can still be productive and fulfill their role to the fullest to their families and to the communities, and they won't be a burden.
So for people who want to find out more about your work and what you're doing, how do they do that?
Well, just go to our website, contact RAPP, that's RAPP campaign.com, and you get all the information you need to get involved in our RAPP, in the RAPP campaign. Also, to contact your legislators, your state senators, state assembly, and tell them that you support the release of aging people in prison. You support these reforms because they are a moderate solution to the injustices that mass incarceration has created.
So there'll be some who are critics who say, listen, you know what? Sounds good, but I'll use Jerry Blue is the one who committed a heinous crime years ago, a very violent crime years ago. I'll even go so far as to say maybe even took a life. But Jerry wants to be released. In a case like that, where there's violent crimes involved, where do you side and what does it look like in terms of release?
Well, Jerry, your example of Jerry should not define that justice in New York State is revenge and perpetual punishment. We should not use a few handful of cases to define justice for literally tens and thousands of people. That we're talking about a system that would impact tens and thousands of families across New York State. That we have to have a system of justice that first and foremost values human transformation, and that we believe that every human being is redeemable, has the capacity toward being redeemed.
So if a judge sentences somebody to life and says, hey, okay, you're sentenced to life. You're saying somewhere around 55, that individual should probably be getting a look?
Yes, absolutely. First and foremost,
no matter the crime.
Irrespective. And let me just say that we are a campaign. RAPP is a campaign that relies on the history. You know, we value the history of social and racial movements that fought against these injustices. And our principles and values stem from the history of resistance to social and racial injustice. And we know that from the very beginning of the creation of the United States of America, the enslaved people were excluded from the human race. Even legal scholars of the settlers excluded the enslaved people from human race. And from that moment on, everything we got today, we fought for. Every single thing from voting on up. So now we cannot turn around and exclude anybody from parole justice because we believe that all human beings that are incarcerated have redeeming value.
Right. So how do you answer the family who says, listen, that individual that you're advocating for, maybe a person that actually took a life, but now they want to have the benefits of life through early release? How would you answer a family?
Well, first I'd have to say that we are supported by the biggest crime victims organization in New York State, the Downstate Coalition for Crime Victims, as well as quite a few victims of sexual violence, because we all realize that victims and those who harm people are not totally different. The gap between us is not as wide as people make it to be. In most cases, especially in New York State that I can speak about, we've harmed our own. And that's a major problem. And we come out to heal that harm, not create more harm, to stop others from doing the harm that we did. And the truth of the matter is that if we believe that human beings should get a second chance, we should not exclude anybody from this. Unfortunately, we do not have a system that actually heals the victims of crime. we think that in prison, I've created programs myself to address this issue of those who commit harm are really those who can be a major part in the healing process.
So let's talk about what can we expect coming up from you in the near future.
Well, hopefully we can get some of these reforms. We can start addressing what criminal justice in New York State should really look like, what it should reflect, the values that it should reflect, that the values that our communities keep our communities closely knitted. And I think that in the next session or so, we should actually have a major role in defining what justice should look like in New York State.
For people who want more information, of course, they go to your website. But talk to us a little bit about before we go, COVID, how that's impacted your work, and how much has it slowed it down, if at all?
Well, it has slowed it down. As you know, the population that we advocate primarily for in New York State, they're the elderly, they're the most vulnerable. They have been the most vulnerable for decades. In fact, elder people in New York State face a health crisis every day that they're incarcerated. So when COVID hit, this made matters super urgent. And we organized compassionate release campaign calling on the governor to release several hundred of these elderly people that we identify by name who all have underlying health conditions. We're talking about people not just 55 years old, people in their 70s and have languished in prison already for decades. They pose no risk to public safety. It's a humanitarian crisis that we're dealing with. It's no longer a criminal crisis. We can't look at it from that lens, that the governor should grant clemency to these people, because if they get infected, there's a possibility, a great possibility, that they may not make it. And some of my friends have actually passed away from COVID-19.
Jose, I want to thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice Forums. Appreciate you coming and sharing a little bit about that aging population and early release. Thanks much.
Thank you.
All righty, we're taking a quick break here on the Social Justice Forums. We'll be back with more show right after this.